So who wins and who loses when there's inflation? This graph here shows you misery index. So it's looking at the unemployment rate and inflation, right? People are unhappy if they don't have a job or if they can't afford anything. And we can compare that to what you see here on the left is how happy they are. Okay, so what this graph tells you is that according to most countries, people are happier when inflation is low and unemployment is low. Now, recall back to our goals. Can you get low unemployment, so everyone's working, and low inflation? Well, remember that trade-off between unemployment and inflation? We have a graph for that. What is that graph called that looks at unemployment and inflation? And it looked at the fact that when unemployment is high, inflation is low because we can't afford to buy anything. And when unemployment is low, prices are high because we're all buying stuff. Hopefully you remember that was the Phillips curve. Okay. So ideally people want low unemployment and low inflation, but typically we can't have that because of this relationship that we describe in the Phillips curve. So if high inflation makes people unhappy, we need to understand who wins and who loses when there's inflation. So let's make a list of winners and losers, and let's assume that the inflation is a surprise. It's unanticipated. Okay, so you wake up one day and the prices of everything are double. Who loses, who wins? Well, let's suppose that I lent you $100. Okay, and I lent it to you last week and you're going to pay me back this week. Well, if in the interim, surprise, prices of everything are now double, when you go to give me back the $100, does it buy what it did a week ago? No. When I gave it to you a week ago, you could buy so much more with the $100 than when you gave me the $100 back. So who wins when there is surprise inflation? The one who borrowed the money, because the money they borrowed is worth more than the money they're giving back. Who loses? Well, the creditor, the one who lent the money, because the money they get back doesn't buy as much as before. This is an issue when there is surprise inflation. If inflation is not a surprise, if we can anticipate it, then what could we do as the creditor to make sure we're not disadvantaged? How do we make sure that the money that you give me back is the same as the money I gave you? Well, we charge more interest. But if we don't know there's going to be inflation, we don't know to charge more interest, and so the creditors can lose out. As we look at the winners and losers of surprise inflation, the losers are the taxpayers. Because as we see inflation, inflation causes a cost of living adjustment, right? Your employer has to pay you more because a dead worker is not a good worker. So we have to make sure that you're making enough money to afford food and shelter. So when prices go up and we have inflation, wages go up, which means now more of your money is going to pay taxes, right? Because you've probably been pushed up into a higher tax bracket, you're paying a larger percentage of your income. Who gains is the government. Now, while you're paying them more money, and yes, money is worth less, you're also paying a higher percentage of your money because of what we call bracket creep, because you get pushed up into a higher tax bracket. So the government makes more of your money because not only are you paying more money with your higher income, but you're also paying a bigger percentage. So the government wins out. Next, as we look at who wins and who loses from surprise inflation, is to look at people on a fixed income. So let's say you're retired and you're living off your savings. Well, if the inflation is a surprise, if we didn't know what was going to happen, the people who are working, they can negotiate a higher wage, a cost of living adjustment. But if you're retired and living off your savings is a fixed amount. And so your expenses go up, but your income doesn't. So you become poorer, you lose out. Companies tend to be winners if there's surprise inflation, because when we see surprise inflation, where it impacts the economy first is in the sale of the goods, the final goods and services. So businesses are able to charge more for their products. What is slow to change are things like wages. So while workers will negotiate a cost of living increase, when there's inflation, often we have contracts and we have to wait until the contract is up, until the period of time where our union might negotiate, and only then do we get the cost of living adjustment. So there's a bit of a lag between when businesses sell their products for more and when their costs increase because of contractual agreements. And so for a brief window of time, producers can actually gain from surprise inflation. Now let's look at the issue of financial assets and real assets. So when we talk about real assets, we're talking about your house, maybe you own some art, those things that you own. Financial assets, that's your money, that's your investments. If there is surprise inflation, well, we said that those goods and services that are being sold are the first things that go up in price, which means your house you can now sell for a higher price. Your art you can sell for a higher price. So its price moves with the inflation. Whereas your financial assets, like your money, they don't buy as much as before. And so if you have all of your savings in cash under your mattress and there's surprise inflation, that money under your mattress doesn't buy what it used to. So you're worse off. But if you have all your money invested into real assets, houses, art, jewelry, things like that, you'll be able to sell them at higher prices, and so you are not hurt by that surprise inflation. All right, we got two more to look at, and second to the last one is the issue of futures contracts. So a futures contract is a deal to buy or sell in the future. So futures contracts are used widely when we make commodities. So for example, if you have a farm and you produce wheat, then there's a futures contract where you're agreeing at what price you're going to sell your crop in the future at harvest time. And there are buyers of these future contracts who agree to a price to pay for that wheat in the future. And so you make this deal now, and that's based on what you think the wheat will be worth in the future. So if there's surprise inflation and everything is now more expensive, who wins and who loses? Well, if you're the one selling the wheat in the future, if you knew there was going to be inflation, you would have charged what? More or less? You would have charged more, right? So you would have sold it for more in the future. But since you didn't know the inflation was going to happen, you lose out. So sellers of future contracts are worse off when there's unanticipated inflation. However, if you're the one who's buying the wheat in the future, so you've bought that futures contract, and you didn't know there was going to be inflation, then you got a deal because you're paying way less than now the newer higher price with inflation says you should be paying. So you win out. In general, those who win when there's surprise inflation is those who saw it coming. And those who lose out are those who didn't see it coming. So it's very important to be able to forecast or predict the level of inflation, which is why you take this course and we talk about the causes of inflation and the impacts they have.